How many double shifts does a man like you need to work before he can afford shoes that don't look like they came from a church donation bin? The dining room had gone quiet long before Daniel said a word back. Weston Blackwood had spent the better part of an hour turning a waiter into after-dinner entertainment, needling his shoes, his age, the black apron tied twice around his waist. He spoke the way men speak when nobody has ever once made them answer for anything. Daniel set the wine bottle down slowly, and something about the stillness of that motion made the whole table stop breathing. "Mock me again," Daniel said quietly. "I dare you." Weston laughed and lifted his glass, certain the moment belonged to him. But the snow outside the tall windows of the restaurant kept falling the way it had all evening, steady and indifferent. And somewhere underneath that calm laugh, something had already shifted that no amount of money would be able to put back the way it was. If you like stories where quiet people turn out to be the strongest ones in the room, hit subscribe before this one gets going, because it earns every minute. This is Wintervale, and we're glad you're here. There's something about the first snow of the season that always feels like the world giving people a second chance to be gentle with each other. That's the feeling this next story is built around. A season that asks nothing of you except to notice who's actually paying attention. Stay with us through the whole thing. It's worth it. The dining room at Birchgate Table ran on a kind of performance most guests never noticed. The lighting was tuned to make everyone look wealthier than they were. Conversations were kept low, almost reverent, and the staff moved through the space with the practiced invisibility of people trained to be present without ever being seen. Daniel Hargrove had learned that particular grace 3 years earlier, back when the restaurant hired him with barely a glance at his resume, and he had made an uneasy peace with it since. He was 38, broad-shouldered, with the kind of quiet, weathered handsomeness that made regulars ask for his section without quite knowing why. He knew the wine list by memory. He knew which tables wanted conversation and which ones wanted silence. His manager, Sam Whitaker, had told him more than once that he was the best floor man Birchgate had ever had, and Daniel always thanked him and went back to work because gratitude didn't pay rent by itself. He lived in a narrow 2-bedroom rental on the west side of Denver with his daughter Piper, who was 9 years old and treated the kitchen table like her personal command center every evening. Homework fanned out across every inch of it. The apartment was small, but it was warm, and it was theirs. And after the year his wife Laura had spent in and out of hospitals before she passed, warm and theirs had become the only two things Daniel actually needed from a home. What people rarely guessed, looking at the black apron and the practiced smile, was that Daniel hadn't always worn one. Years before Birchgate, before Piper needed a school with a nurse on call and a father who came home at reliable hours, there had been a company called Northgate Analytics, which Daniel had built from a laptop in his garage with a business partner who was better at raising money than he was at understanding the product. Northgate wrote forecasting software for supply chains, the kind of precise, elegant code most people never think about, the invisible math that tells a warehouse in Ohio how many winter coats to order before the first cold snap hits. Daniel had built the core of it himself, late at night, the way some people write music, not because anyone told him to, but because the logic of it satisfied something in him that little else did. Then Piper's heart started skipping in ways it wasn't supposed to. It wasn't a small thing. It required a specialist, a surgery with a narrow window, and a number attached to it that made Daniel's stomach drop the first time he heard it out loud. He sold his shares in Northgate for far less than they were worth, in a hospital conference room, while a nurse waited 2 doors down to tell him it was time. The men who bought his shares knew exactly what they were getting and exactly why he was signing. He had traded a company for his daughter's next 50 years, and he had never once regretted the math on that trade. 2 years later, Northgate was folded into a much larger firm called Blackwood Dynamics, and the software Daniel had written by hand became the backbone of its most profitable product, a forecasting platform called ClearPath. Daniel read about the acquisition on his phone on the light rail on his way to a dinner shift, folded the article away in his mind the way you fold away a photograph of a house you used to live in, and went to work. Sam Whitaker had his own reasons for looking out for Daniel the way he did, though he rarely talked about them. He'd run a small steakhouse of his own once, out in Colorado Springs, and lost it during a brutal winter downturn when 2 of his biggest accounts pulled out within a month of each other. He knew exactly what it looked like when a man was one bad week away from losing something he'd spent years quietly building. and he'd promised himself, watching his own name come off that old lease, that he wouldn't stand by while it happened to someone working under him if there was anything at all he could do about it. Weston Blackwood walked into Birchgate on a Thursday evening with 3 people trailing behind him like satellites. One was a junior aide who nodded at everything Weston said before Weston finished saying it. The other 2 belonged to a strategy firm called Ashworth Collins, and one of them, a woman named Naomi Ashworth, sat with her hands folded on the table and the composed patience of someone who had survived 100 dinners exactly like this one. Weston was 49 and worth, depending on which quarter you asked, somewhere north of $2 billion, nearly all of it sitting on top of a company his own father had started in a rented office decades earlier and handed to him with the quiet, crushing expectation that he'd only ever make it bigger, never smaller. Weston had spent most of his adult life afraid of being the generation that broke something his father built, and that fear rarely looked like fear from the outside. Mostly it looked exactly like what it looked like that night at Birchgate. Weston wanted Ashworth Collins to handle the public rollout of ClearPath's next version. He had booked the best table in the house, ordered a bottle before anyone sat down, and spent the first 20 minutes of the evening establishing, in small ways, that everyone at that table worked for him, whether they drew a paycheck from him or not. Daniel was assigned the table, the way he was assigned most of the difficult ones, because Sam trusted him not to flinch. Weston was 49, precisely dressed, with the kind of presence that seemed to bend a room's attention toward him without ever raising his voice. Naomi watched him with an expression Daniel recognized instantly, the particular tiredness of someone who had learned exactly how these 2 hours were going to unfold and had stopped expecting otherwise. Daniel approached, introduced himself, and began describing the evening's specials. Weston cut him off before he finished the second sentence and asked, without looking at the menu, what Daniel would recommend from the reserve list from memory. It wasn't a question. It was a test, and Daniel had served enough tables to know the difference. He named 5 wines, described their vintages, and paired 2 of them with dishes Naomi had already been eyeing. Weston asked for a bottle Birchgate didn't carry, and when Daniel offered an equal alternative, Weston waved it off and pointed at something else entirely, as if the exchange had never happened. Weston spent the next stretch of the meal talking mostly past Daniel rather than to him, narrating for his aide's benefit how a real restaurant should be run, how service in cities like Denver never quite matched what he was used to in bigger markets, how he supposed people did their best with what they had out here. His aide nodded along at each remark like it was the first time he'd heard it, and Naomi kept her eyes on her plate, not agreeing, not objecting, just waiting the way people wait out weather. The night's first real snow was falling outside the windows by then, fat, unhurried flakes drifting past the glass like the sky had all the time in the world, which made the warmth and tension inside the dining room feel even more airless by comparison. The humiliation arrived after the second bottle. Weston had been watching Daniel move between tables, and he raised his voice just enough to make sure the whole table could hear him. "How many double shifts does it take to afford shoes like that?" he asked, tilting his glass toward Daniel's feet. "Or did somebody hand them down to you?" When Daniel didn't react, Weston kept going. "Must be something, spending your nights carrying plates for people who could buy this whole building without checking a balance." Someone at the far end laughed, the uneasy laugh people use when they want credit for not being sure it's funny. Naomi didn't laugh. She looked down at the tablecloth instead, and Daniel noticed, the way he noticed most things without appearing to. Weston asked, almost idly, "You got kids? If you do, I wonder if they're proud of what their old man does for a living." That was the sentence that changed the shape of the evening. Daniel set the bottle down on the table with a care that looked, to anyone watching, less like restraint and more like the last calm second before a decision. He looked directly at Weston and said it quietly enough that it shouldn't have carried past the table. "Mock me again," he said. "I dare you." Everyone at the table heard it anyway. Weston laughed, glanced around for an audience, and said, "And what exactly do you think a waiter can do to a man like me?" Daniel didn't reach for a threat. He looked instead at the tablet propped at the edge of the table, its screen still glowing with the summary slides of the ClearPath rollout. "There are 3 structural errors in the model behind those slides," he said, nodding toward it. "Not typos, the kind that only show up when somebody modifies an algorithm without understanding how its foundation was built. If ClearPath launches with those still in it, Your biggest pending contract won't deliver in its first quarter, and everything after that gets worse. He said it the way he might describe a wine's finish, calm and unhurried. Weston went very still. The errors Daniel had named weren't public information. They were a problem his engineering team had spent 3 months quietly trying to bury. "Mock me again," Daniel said again, just as quiet as before. "I dare you." Naomi was looking at Daniel now with a kind of attention that had nothing to do with the apron he was wearing. Weston demanded to speak with Sam Whitaker before he left the building. "He's gone before his next shift," he told Sam, with the calm certainty of a man used to getting exactly what he asked for. "Or every Blackwood Dynamics event on the books here gets moved somewhere else." Sam listened without interrupting, then said evenly, "We don't fire staff for defending themselves against a guest's abuse. Happy to discuss anything else." After Weston stormed out into the snow, Sam quietly pulled the restaurant's internal camera footage and saved a full, unedited copy of everything that had happened at that table. He told no one. He simply filed it somewhere he could find again, suspecting, given what he'd just watched, that he probably would need to. Naomi stayed behind after the others left. She told Daniel she was sorry she hadn't said anything sooner, set her card on the table along with enough cash to cover several of his shifts, and waited. Daniel slid both items back toward her and told her that what she was offering couldn't undo what had already happened, and that she might want to consider the order of things, that she had stayed silent through the mockery and only spoken once she discovered the waiter knew something worth respecting. He wasn't accusing her of being unkind. He was only pointing out that those two facts had happened in a specific sequence, and the sequence mattered. Naomi took her card back. She left the cash on the table anyway, and Daniel left it there too when he cleared the glasses an hour later. Naomi had spent most of her career learning how to sit across from men like Weston without flinching, which meant she'd also spent most of her career training herself not to react to much of anything at all. It had cost her a marriage that ended quietly a few years back, mostly because she'd gotten so good at not reacting that her husband eventually stopped bothering to say anything worth reacting to. Watching Daniel refuse her money without an ounce of performance in it had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit, mostly because it reminded her how long it had been since she'd watched anyone mean exactly what they said. By the next afternoon, Weston had someone running a background check on Daniel Hargrove, expecting to find nothing more than what the apron suggested. What came back instead was a man who had co-founded Northgate Analytics and built its core technology by hand, sold it under terms the buyers understood perfectly well, and watched that technology move through 2 more acquisitions until it became the exact platform Weston had been pitching at dinner. His aide read the summary out loud twice, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less inconvenient on a second pass, and Weston sat with his jaw tight for a long moment before telling him to keep digging, certain there had to be something in the man's history worth using against him. The man he had spent an evening mocking, the man he had tried to have fired that same night, was the person who had built the foundation his company's entire future was standing on, and that man knew precisely where its cracks were. Daniel went home that night in the snow, made Piper dinner, helped her finish a diorama of the water cycle for school, and let her stay up 20 minutes past her bedtime because the conversation was good. He didn't tell her anything about the evening, though part of his mind kept circling the decision that was already forming somewhere underneath everything else he was doing. He had spent 3 years building something small and quiet on purpose. He hadn't chased Northgate through lawyers or headlines. That had been deliberate. But Weston wasn't a man who let a threat sit unanswered, and a broken platform about to launch would hurt people who'd never heard the name Daniel Hargrove and would have no idea why their supply chains had started failing. He stood at the kitchen window after Piper fell asleep, watching the snow collect on the fire escape, and thought about the distance between staying quiet and letting something bad happen to strangers. He wasn't sure, yet those were the same thing. What he was sure of was that Weston had looked at him across that table and seen someone who didn't matter, and that certainty, more than anything else, was going to become somebody's problem before long. The video appeared online on a Tuesday morning, and by noon 3 separate gossip accounts with a combined following in the millions had picked it up. Whoever filmed it had chosen the angle carefully. The clip opened with Daniel already holding the bottle, staring Weston down, his voice clear enough to make out every syllable. It cut away before Weston had said a single word that started any of it. What strangers online saw was a waiter threatening a billionaire out of nowhere, and the caption on the first post called him unhinged. By Wednesday, articles were describing Daniel as volatile, a man with a grudge, someone who had turned a routine service complaint into a scene. Several used nearly identical phrasing, the kind that suggested they'd all been fed by the same source. Daniel read two of them on his break, put his phone away, and finished his shift because Piper still needed picking up at 4. The harder part came through Piper's direction. A classmate had found the video and shown it around at recess. And by Thursday afternoon, more than one kid had told her that her father was probably going to jail for threatening a rich man. She came home quieter than usual, sat at the kitchen table without opening her backpack, and studied Daniel with the same careful, measuring look she'd worn in the months after Laura died, like she was trying to figure out how much truth was safe to ask for. She wanted to know if he'd done something wrong. She didn't ask it like an accusation. She asked it the way a 9-year-old asks when she already suspects the real answer is complicated and needs to hear it from the one person she still trusts completely. Daniel sat across from her and told her everything. What Weston had said about his shoes and his job, and whether his kids were proud of him, and that he'd answered the way he did because some things don't deserve to go unanswered, and that whoever cut the video had removed the part that explained why. Piper listened, then said that didn't seem fair. Daniel told her it wasn't, and she seemed to accept that the way kids sometimes accept hard truths when the adult they love doesn't try to make the truth smaller than it actually is. Naomi reached out the following evening. She met Daniel outside Birchgate after his shift, on a bench dusted with fresh snow at the edge of a small plaza, and told him she wanted to release a public statement describing exactly what had happened at that table, which would make the video irrelevant within 2 days. She also offered him a position at Ashworth Collins, better pay, real hours, a desk instead of a floor. Daniel listened to all of it and said no to both. Her statement, he said, would shift the story from what Weston did to Naomi's relationship with both of them, and Weston's people would find a way to use that shift. As for the job, the fact that her first instinct was to move him somewhere better told him she still saw his current life as something broken that needed fixing rather than something he'd actually chosen. Naomi said she didn't know what to do with someone who refused every exit she offered him. Daniel told her that was because she was still looking for exits, and he wasn't. For a moment, neither of them said anything else, and Naomi looked like she was about to add something more, something that had nothing to do with statements or job offers. But her phone lit up in her coat pocket before she could get the words out, and whatever it was passed by unspoken. She walked back to her car through the snow, understanding something new about him that she hadn't expected, and not entirely comfortable with what it meant about the way she usually operated. The second blow landed 4 days later, when a financial outlet ran a piece claiming Daniel had abandoned Northgate at its most critical development stage, cashing out just before the company needed him most, leaving his engineering team stranded. The article never mentioned Piper, never mentioned a hospital or a surgeon or a decision made under conditions most of its readers would never have to imagine. It quoted an unnamed former colleague calling Daniel a man who had always cared more about the payout than the product. Birchgate started losing reservations within the week. Sam told Daniel that corporate bookings that had stood for months were being quietly canceled, that Blackwood Dynamics associates were calling regular clients and mentioning the word hostile alongside Daniel's name. Daniel offered to take a leave of absence so the restaurant would stop absorbing consequences that belonged to him alone. Sam refused flatly, told him Birchgate didn't cave to pressure like that, and that as long as he ran the floor, Daniel had a job on it. The same week, the landlord holding the small commercial space Daniel had been quietly negotiating a lease on, tucked away in a converted brick storefront near his apartment, sent a short email saying he'd reviewed the recent coverage and decided to go with another tenant. 3 years of careful savings, set aside a little at a time even during months when Piper needed new boots or a school trip came up unannounced, had just become a plan with nowhere left to go. Naomi called and offered to acquire the lease through a holding company no one would trace back to her. Daniel said no. If Weston's people were watching, and they clearly were, a property connected to Naomi Ashworth appearing near his name would confirm every story already written about him, that he'd attached himself to a wealthy woman to recover what he'd lost. He wasn't going to hand them that headline. There was a long pause on the line before Naomi said it felt like watching someone drown and being told not to throw the rope. Daniel told her the rope was tied to something, and he needed to know what was on the other end before he grabbed it. The reporter found Piper outside her school on a bitter Friday morning, ice glazing the sidewalk in a thin, unforgiving sheet. She'd been waiting near the side entrance and approached Piper directly, asking what she knew about Northgate Analytics and whether her father ever talked about a man named Weston at home. Piper didn't answer. She turned and walked toward the street instead, and a car easing around the corner had to brake hard on the ice to keep from clipping her as she stepped off the curb. She was fine, just badly shaken, and the school kept her inside with the counselor until Daniel arrived within the hour. She sat in the back seat with her backpack on her lap the whole ride home, watching the gray afternoon slide past the window, and Daniel didn't try to fill the silence, because some silences aren't looking for anything to fill them. For 3 nights after that, Piper wanted the hallway light left on, something she hadn't asked for since the year Laura died, and she flinched a little every time a car outside braked hard on the icy street below their window. Daniel sat with her until she fell asleep each of those nights, and told her over and over that none of what had happened to her was her fault, that grown-ups had made a mess of things, and she'd simply gotten caught in it, and slowly the flinching eased, though the hallway light stayed on a while longer regardless. That night, after Piper had gone to bed, Daniel pulled the folder of restaurant sketches down from the closet shelf, the floor plan, the draft menu, the little chalkboard idea he and Piper had drawn together one Saturday the previous spring. He set it all in a box on the kitchen table, meaning to put it somewhere out of sight, somewhere that wasn't a daily reminder of a plan that no longer felt like it belonged to him. Piper came out of her room and stood in the doorway. She looked at the box, then at him, and said she thought he'd always told her that what other people said about you didn't get to decide who you were. She said she was pretty sure she'd heard him say that more than once. She asked why he was letting people who were lying about him decide what he was allowed to want for himself. Daniel had no answer for her. He sat there with his hands flat on top of that box, the kitchen light humming overhead, his daughter watching him from the doorway, and for the first time in a long while he didn't have a single thing to say back. In the morning, he found something tucked under the lid. Piper had gotten up before him and dug through the papers until she found the very first sketch, the one with the corner booth and the open kitchen and the chalkboard by the door, and set it on top of everything else, face down, with something written on the back in her careful, too large handwriting, the way she wrote when she wanted something to look official. It read, "The place that stays warm even when everything outside is frozen." Daniel read it twice. He put it back in the box, made Piper breakfast, and when she came out of her room, he told her the restaurant was still happening. She looked at him over her cereal bowl, trying very hard not to show how relieved she was, then said she already knew that, and the conversation moved on to other things, the way it does once the important part has already been settled. He called Naomi that afternoon. She picked up on the second ring. He told her he was ready to use whatever she'd found, on one condition that wasn't negotiable, that she'd provide the documentation, make sure the right people had access to the right room, and then step back completely. She wouldn't speak for him. She wouldn't position herself as his advocate. When the moment came, the only voice making his case would be his own. Naomi agreed. She'd already been quietly reviewing the technical files in the Blackwood Dynamics investor package during a late night at her office, and buried in the platform's original architecture history, she'd found version control signatures that hadn't been properly scrubbed, one of them registered under a name she now recognized instantly. She'd cross-checked it against public filings from Northgate's early years and sat with what she found for a long time before calling him. She told him she'd already sent copies of the records to 7 investors that morning, quietly, before 8, so the documentation would already be sitting in the room before anyone knew Daniel was coming. Then she told him she'd make sure he was on the guest list for the launch event, and that she'd stay out of his way once he got there. The venue for the ClearPath launch was the kind of place built to make money feel inevitable. High ceilings, low light, rows of chairs curving toward a stage banked with screens. Weston's team had spent the morning arranging cables and slides to suggest that what was about to be announced had always been the natural direction of things. Weston spotted Daniel roughly 3 seconds after he walked in, and something moved across his face that his usual composure almost, but not quite, managed to hide. Within a minute, 2 members of venue security were moving toward Daniel from the side of the room. Daniel didn't wait for them. He walked straight to the front, where the screens were still cycling through pre-show slides. "My name is Daniel Hargrove," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "I built the core architecture behind the technology you're about to see presented as original work, and the proof of that is already sitting in several inboxes in this room." Security reached him, and he held up one hand and kept talking, describing the platform's architecture to a room full of people who understood exactly what he was describing, with the precision of someone who had built it himself and remembered every decision along the way. Weston's aide leaned toward him and murmured something urgent, glancing at the phones already rising throughout the audience. But Weston waved him off and climbed onto the stage himself, apparently deciding this was a problem better handled in front of everyone than quietly afterward. "What you're watching," Weston told the room, in the reasonable voice he used for cameras, "is a disgruntled former associate who walked away from a legitimate deal years ago and decided a launch event was the place to air his grievance instead of pursuing proper channels. A man who abandoned his own company and has spent the years since carrying plates and nursing a grudge." Daniel let him finish. "You're half right about one thing," he said. "I did sell my shares in Northgate. I did it in a hospital conference room because my daughter needed heart surgery and there was no other way to pay for it inside the window her surgeon gave us. The people who bought those shares knew exactly why I was signing. Call that abandonment if you want. But maybe this room should decide what word it wants to use for a father who had the option to walk away from a sick kid and didn't take it. Nobody's here for your personal problems," Weston said. "The only reason you're standing in this room is because a wealthy woman felt sorry for you." Daniel looked at him steadily, and what crossed his face wasn't anger. It was the particular calm of someone who had waited a long time for the right moment and had just recognized it arriving. "I lost a company once," Daniel said. "I kept my daughter. If you handed me that same choice again tomorrow, same conditions, I'd sign the same papers without thinking twice. And there's no version of success I could have had at Northgate that would have been worth more than the one I actually got." Then he connected his phone to the presentation system, and the screens filled with the footage Sam had preserved from that first dinner, every second of it intact, in order. The room watched Weston ask a man how many double shifts it took to afford decent shoes, watched the comments about the apron, about gratitude, about whether his children were proud of him, and then watched Daniel set the bottle down and say the 6 words that had started all of it. The room went silent in a way that had nothing to do with theater. Weston Blackwood stood on his own stage with no answer ready, and for the first time in Daniel's experience of him, that was visibly true. The board of Blackwood Dynamics moved fast once the investor reaction made the cost of delay obvious. Weston was suspended within 72 hours, pending an internal review of the platform's origins and the edited footage that had started circulating. The outlets that had painted Daniel as an opportunist quietly updated their coverage, several running the full, unedited clip without commentary, and public opinion recalibrated the way it usually does once it finally has all the pieces. At the review hearing that followed, one board member stood out. Corinne Falk, the company's longest-serving director, a woman known mostly for staying quiet in meetings where everyone else was loud, spoke up. "A man who can dismantle a lie that carefully, in front of strangers, in a room that wasn't built to be kind to him, deserves better than what this company gave him," she said. "And if this board can't tell the difference between a threat and a man defending his family, that's a failure worth fixing long before it becomes his problem to solve." Her voice didn't rise once. Nobody argued with her. "I've sat through 11 years of meetings watching men like Weston mistake volume for authority," she added. "The quietest man in that video said more true things in 6 words than I've heard in most of those 11 years combined." Weston started to object. Corinne simply looked at him until he stopped. The legal conversation that followed took several weeks. At the end of it, Daniel accepted a royalty arrangement for the use of the architecture he'd originally built, not as a settlement, but as the honest financial acknowledgement of what his work had actually been worth. He turned down the board's offer of a leadership role at Blackwood Dynamics without much hesitation, telling the attorneys he wasn't interested in running something he hadn't chosen to build because he had somewhere else to be. Part of what he received went into an account under Piper's name that she wouldn't touch until she was older. The rest went toward the lease on that brick storefront near their apartment, the landlord having quietly reversed course once the story finished changing shape in the press. Frostline Kitchen opened on a Thursday in early winter with no press event and no invitation sent to anyone from that world, because the kitchen was finally ready and there was no good reason left to keep waiting. Sam showed up on opening night without being asked, still in his Birchgate uniform because he'd come straight from his own shift, and stood in the doorway of Frostline Kitchen for a long moment before he said anything at all. He told Daniel it looked exactly like the kind of place a man builds when he's finally done shrinking himself for other people's comfort, then pulled him into a hug that neither of them mentioned again afterward, the way men who've worked dining rooms together for years tend not to. Naomi reviewed the lease terms when Daniel asked her to, caught two clauses that would have caused trouble at renewal, and billed him her standard hourly rate, which he insisted on paying, because that was the extent of what he'd asked for, and she'd finally learned to wait until he asked. Their relationship grew slowly after that, not out of caution exactly, but because they'd both spent enough years in rooms full of people performing closeness instead of building it, and neither wanted to make that mistake again. Naomi started coming by 2 or 3 evenings a week, always the same table near the window, never with a laptop or an agenda. On the slow nights, Daniel would sit across from her once the floor was covered, and they'd talk about decisions and what makes some of them so hard, about whether being right can ever cost more than it returns. There was one evening in late January, snow falling thick and unhurried past the window the way it had that first night at Birchgate, when Naomi told him she'd turned down a partnership offer at her own firm because it would have meant relocating, and she hadn't been able to make herself say yes, and she wasn't entirely sure why. Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of pause that could have gone several different ways, and she watched him decide something before he said it out loud, that maybe she already knew why and just hadn't wanted to say it first. Neither of them moved for a second. Then she reached across the table, and this time neither of them pulled back. Piper did her homework most evenings at a small table near the kitchen pass, apparently finding the noise of a working dinner service more conducive to concentration than actual silence ever was. She no longer changed the subject when classmates asked what her father did for a living. She told them he ran a restaurant, and sometimes added that it was the kind of place where nobody had to earn the right to be treated like a person. Daniel still worked the floor some nights himself, not to prove anything about where he'd come from, but because he was good at it and valued a room where the food and the service were both right, where people felt, without being able to say exactly why, that they'd walked into somewhere made with care rather than for show. There was a small framed line of handwriting near the prep station, visible to everyone who worked there, that Daniel had written on a scrap of paper one night and Piper had insisted they frame. It read simply, "No one who walks in here is smaller than anyone else who does." Across town, Weston Blackwood's name started disappearing from the kinds of headlines it used to fill. There are rooms where power quietly leaves the building long before anyone outside notices it's gone. At Frostline, Daniel never hung the footage anywhere, never displayed the version control records or the attribution letters that had finally confirmed, publicly, what he'd known about himself the whole time. The restaurant wasn't built to make a point about the past. It was built to be somewhere worth coming back to, somewhere that filled a room with something quieter and more durable than people performing for each other, the feeling of being seen and having that be the beginning of the evening instead of an afterthought. Daniel Hargrove hadn't become a different man through any of it. He'd simply found a room, finally, where the man he'd always been could stand at his full height without anyone asking him to shrink first. Some people assume dignity is something you earn through money or a title or the right address. Daniel had learned, the hard way, that it works the other way around, that he'd carried it into every room he ever walked into long before anyone in those rooms was willing to notice. If this story reminded you that how we treat the people we assume can't push back says everything about who we really are, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if you want more stories about quiet people who turn out to be the strongest ones in the room, subscribe to Winter Veil and stay close. We're only getting started.